excited to see and ultimately to learn with all of you. Just as a prelude, I just wanted to thank all those who participated in the wonderful Kenes, L'Tfilah, L'Geula. Yesterday, each and every one of you truly contributed to the continuation of the unfolding of Geula, seeing us all come together. So, mamash, toda. And today, as you see, we're going to take a look at an intertextual approach to the writings of Shmuel HaNavi. For those in our regular Shmuel class every Wednesday, again on Sundays in Beit Shemesh, we've seen how the art of allusion of an author who's referring back to previous stories helps highlight the interpretation of the story. At the same time, the midrashic device of intertextuality, where one actually learns the text together as if they're occurring at the same time, so that you can hear the melody together with the harmony. That's more of a midrashic device, except in one case. And that's a case where the author, living in a particular time period in history, is writing 3 simultaneous works, albeit each one focused on a different time period. If he's writing them all simultaneously, then is there conscious intertextuality? In fact, there must be, because he recognizes that it's the same style, same terminology. We know ourselves, and writing different works, writing sometimes even different letters or emails today at the same time, and we're going to naturally have our automatic associations from one context to the other. What's remarkable, though, is when it comes to religious literature, namely the works of the prophets, in particular, as we're going to be exploring today, the writings of Shmuel HaNavi, the conscious intertextuality is really meant to enable us, the reader, to extrapolate as many religious messages as possible. Shmuel HaNavi assumes that you're going to read all 3 of his works, and therefore, instead of elaborating on thematic ideas, sometimes all he needs to do is draw certain associations. And we're going to focus, especially inspired by many of the stories that we've seen in Sefer Shmuel, particularly chapters 14 and 15, where we see that the idea of the Laila, Kol HaLaila, that we have to hear about what happens at night. That night seems to be a very particular time, carrying with it its own particular significance in the writing of Shmuel. So we begin with what Chazal teach us in Pesach Baba Batra, namely that Shmuel HaNavi is the author of Sefer Shmuel and of Sefer Shoftim, recording basically 350 years worth of national stories, of military conflicts, of leadership issues prior to the time period of Shmuel, highlighted by the motif that recurs at the end of Sefer Shoftim of Ein Melech B'Yisrael, Ish Hayashar Beinav Yaseh, recognizing that Shmuel himself is reflecting upon a time period of anarchy, which will serve as a basis for his time period of request for monarchy. And then certainly also the work of Ruth, which he also places Vayhi B'mei Shvot HaShoftim. So both Sefer Shoftim and Sefer Ruth, written during the same time that he's writing Sefer Shmuel. As a matter of fact, one can even prove from the story of Ruth that he's not just writing about events that happened before his time, by virtue of the fact that how does Sefer Ruth end? Va'oved holedet Yishai, v'Yishai holedet David. Shmuel HaNavi himself only knows about David HaMelech at the conclusion of chapter 15 of Sefer Shmuel, after Shaul has served as a tremendous disappointment in the eyes of Hashem, and then Hashem implores of Shmuel to coronate David as the next king in the eyes of Hashem. That being the case, he is going to write Sefer Shoftim even after he's written certain chapters of Sefer Shmuel, and similarly, writing Sefer Ruth clearly only after writing a significant number of chapters of Sefer Shmuel as well. And therefore, when we look and focus particularly on the motif of the night, of how Shmuel HaNavi is going to relate to events of the night, we're going to see how he wants to not only tell us about the precarious nature of the night, but the significance of night scenes that then refer all the way back to stories of the Torah as well. And obviously, as we approach on this Yom Iyun, and this day in particular, dedicated in memory of Rami and Blanche Shapiro, Zachronam Livracha, we now appreciate that our learning is going to prepare us for the significance of the Pesach night as well. So much so that the 3rd century Paitan in Eretz Yisrael named Yanai composed a beautiful piyut that we all recite on the night of the Seder of Vayhi B'Chatzi Halayla, a different night scenes that we find in the Torah. For example, by Avram Avinu, when he went to redeem his nephew Lot, it says he went by Yarach Hanichav Balayla. So what the scenes of Abraham and happening Balayla, interestingly, and note that he doesn't just say Balayla, but when did this event happen of the redemption of the hostages? B'Chatzi Halayla. And he clearly is alluding, even though it doesn't say that, in a Sefer Bereshit, in Perek Yud Gimel, or again in Perek Yud Gimel, where we find the story told, Perek Yud Daled, and we see that the primary idea is to refer back to Vayhi B'Chatzi Halayla. If the Torah is going out of its way to tell us that this scene happened at night, then we know of one fateful night where tremendous events happened that drastically altered the trajectory of Jewish history. And what night is that? The night of Pesach, which isn't just described as the Laila, but Chatzot Halayla, B'Chatzi Halayla. And therefore, building off of midrashic associations of significant, drastic, and certainly climactic night scenes, Chazal will tell us anytime you see a drastic night scene, it must have happened when? Leil HaSeder. And especially if you see themes of redemption. Here, we're speaking about Abraham saving his enslaved nephew Lot, Balayla. Yes, this is already an allusion to the night of redemption from slavery, the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And we shouldn't be surprised because Chazal will note various associations. For example, whenever we find the term Hayom, not just Ayom, but Hayom, the day, Chazal will say there is a particular day where we find that people are judged, and therefore these Hayom seem to be times when someone's fate is altered. Individuals, people's fate will be altered in so many stories that begin with Vayhi Hayom. And therefore Chazal say every Hayom is which fate altering date? Rosh Hashanah, or sometimes Yom Kippur. Similarly then, the Laila, the times that especially there will be freedom from slavery, tremendous salvation. Nights of salvation will always refer back to the night of ultimate national salvation, the night of Leil HaSeder. So we have also, as we know, God coming at Danta Melech B'Chalom Laila. If God came to Abimelech to return Sarah, to save Sarah, who was captive by the king, then of course it happened at night, not just any night, B'Chatzi Halayla. Or Lavan, God came to Lavan at night to stop harassing Yaakov, who had run away, definitely reminiscing of Paro and Bnei Israel. Of course, it was a B'Chatzi Halayla, and Yaakov with his ultimate struggle against Vayivater Yaakov Levado, V'Yabeki Shimo, Yaakov and confronting the Malach Balayla. Again, certainly then a story that led to Israel to national salvation. That will also be B'Chatzi Halayla. So we have not only Makat Bechorot at night, the redemption, the salvation from Sisera, must have been B'Chatzi Halayla. The story of Sancheriv, of his entire army being wiped out at night. It must have been Leil HaSeder, salvation from our enemies. B'Chatzi Halayla, salvation from Babel at night. Daniel, again, also all of his dreams, his night visions about ultimate salvation and redemption of Am Yisrael, those must have been, again, referring back to the night of salvation and redemption. B'Chatzi Halayla. We continue with Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, who saw the writing of the wall. Don't worry, it was a night scene. Again, a writing of the wall. Teku, Tekelu Parsin. We're going to be to be redeemed from the Babylonians. Yes, at night. Again, Daniel, at night. Haman. Do you remember Balayla who? Nadidash, Nat Hamelach, Sanach, Natar, Agagi, Kataf, Svarim, Balayla. Again, those were also times of salvation. Again, both Haman, Edom, and as we turn the page, we see the allusions then to the ultimate Geula as well. Again, Purat Drol, Sarat Kashomer, Sachachat Boker, Gam Laila. That's why Karev Yom Asher Hu Lo Yom Laila. Therefore, everyone get ready because the ultimate redemption will happen when? Balayla. And don't get nervous for tonight. Again, for any, sirens, and it may happen. But which night? Get ready for less than 2 weeks' time. Because if it's going to happen, then chances are, when will that ultimate national salvation take place? Not just at night, but on that same remarkable night of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And therefore we turn back to Shmuel Perek Yud Bet as you see, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla. It wasn't just a night scene. It was b'chatzi halayla. It was midnight. And in fact, we see that there are only 2 other places where this term b'chatzi halayla appears. And what do you know? They're both in the writings of Shmuel HaNavi. One in Sefer Shoftim, referring to Shimshon, Vayishkav Shimshon ad chatzi halayla, Vayakam b'chatzi halayla, Vayachaz b'daltot shar ha'ir. And we're going to explore this story further as we build up to it. And then in Ruth as well, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla. The scene of Boaz and Ruth and the Goren on the threshing floor happens not just at night, but Shmuel goes out of his way to tell us that it happens b'chatzi halayla, at midnight. The Baal HaTurim on Sefer Shemot remarkably explicates b'chatzi halayla. He says, Shlosha b'misorah. We have in our tradition 3 mentionings of this specific term of b'chatzi halayla at midnight. But first, he notes the exact same term of Vayhi b'chatzi halayla that Shmuel employs in Sefer Ruth when Boaz is very nervous and basically faints when he sees Ruth by his feet in the middle of the night. Lomar shegam kan chardu charada gdola, to tell us that what are these fateful night scenes? It's not just night, it's midnight when there's scary scenes. These are, as we said, climactic scenes. These are scenes where, again, we could either be destroyed or we could be saved. These are remarkable scenes then of salvation. And also, Gabi Shimshon, Vayakam kachatzi halayla, be'inyana da'aza. Everyone get ready. Because with regard to Asa, salvation from Asa. Okay, I hope you're all thinking already and getting excited. Salvation from Asa happens when? The night of the Seder, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla. So I thought it was last year. So I don't know about you, but definitely after a Kenes L'Geula, it's now. It's again, Be'ezrat Hashem. Again, let's just remember that it started here again at this shiur. We all got excited already. Again, because in fact, the Baal HaTurim says also by Asa. Why specifically do these scenes happen? B'chatzi halayla. Lomar lecha shakadosh baruch hu osa nes l'tzadikim b'chatzi halayla. Because Hashem wants these miracles to happen for tzadikim, for righteous individuals, particularly at midnight. What is it about midnight? What is it about night scenes, but these midnight scenes in particular? The Mechilta explains beautifully, why do we have to hear b'chatzi halayla? Keep in mind, that once upon a time, especially in technologically advanced Egypt, which was completely based on the sundial and the solar culture, night was the absence really of time. And so it wouldn't really make such a difference once the sun set, whether it was 9 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night, at midnight. So why do we need to hear b'chatzi halayla? Lefi shenamar vayoma Moshe kol Hashem kechatzot halayla ni yotzei b'toch Mitzrayim. So much so that Moshe had to explicate before Paro that God is going to strike the Egyptians, the firstborn, particularly at midnight. Particularly to teach us that as opposed to the Egyptian powers, as opposed to the powers of what they called Ra, the sun god, where they felt that they can control, because they were the first culture to be able to say, I will meet you at midday. When is midday? When the sun hits the sundial right in the middle. But no human being can comprehend when the middle of the night is, because there's no sun. So how do I know when the middle of the night is? You don't. That's when God's control is most manifest. Tell Paro that he doesn't control the night, and therefore he doesn't even know when Kechatzot Halayla is. So much so that Hashem actually tells Moshe, tell Paro, Bechatzot Halayla. But when Moshe speaks to Paro, he says, Kechatzot, explains Rashi, quoting the Midrash, because Paro could always claim that, no, it didn't happen at 12, it happened at 11:59. And a Paro can claim that he knows Bechatzot Halayla, but does he? No, so just tell him Kechatzot, which he also cannot control. That's the time of God's control. Kan Yotzro Chalko. The sun doesn't divide up the night. Neither does the moon. Who divides up the night? Only Hashem. Wow. We now take a look then and try to imagine Shmuel HaNavi in a contemporary sense with 3 computer screens open in front of him at the same time. On one of the screens, he's immersed in the composition of the religious historiographical work of Sefer Shoftim, focused on issues of leadership that are important for people to recognize for the sake of creating the ultimate ideal Malchut leadership. Then in front of him, he has the screen of Sefer Shmuel, right? He's writing the events as they occur, also those somewhat post facto. And then on his left big screen, he has Sefer Ruth by Hebrew Meishvot HaShoftim, literally parallel to Sefer Shoftim. And he's going to write numerous stories, again, that bring us back to not only the stories of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but the stories indeed of Laila. And just as we saw that in the Piyot of Yanai, the first he begins with not just Abraham, but Sisra, the general of Canaan, was defeated at night. We're going to begin. We don't see so many allusions at the beginning of Sefer Shoftim, but comes along Shoftim Perek Daled. And in order to make sure that we finish 3 screens all within 48 minutes, and instead we're going to summarize in a chart form. I hope that's okay. And I have to share with you something remarkable, and that is that I figured, you know what? In order to compose this very nicely, I'm going to employ ChatGPT, a little bit of Tanakh artificial intelligence, to create charts. And I asked them, please compose a chart and comparing the story of Devorah, and I wrote all the chapters and the verses to the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, chapters and verses. Please focus on the theme of night. Please focus on the words Vayahom. Please focus on the idea of a Shira. Please focus on the role of women. And feel free to elaborate. And ChatGPT's response to me was, that's incredible. Really, that was that's incredible. And they composed a chart, and I'm going to be honest with you, they left out majority of the allusions, telling me that ChatGPT should not be relied upon for Bikiyut Tanakh. So I had to add to our artificial intelligence. But let's take a look. Again, in fact, they did compose a nice chart though. And after all the information was fed in. So we do see, obviously, the theme of divine intervention, which is going to be the theme expressed through the idea of Vayaham Hashem. There are only 3 times in all of Tanakh that we find this word Vayaham Hashem. And in the story of Shirat Hayam, of Kriyat Yamsuf, In the story of Devorah and Barak's battle against the ancient Canaanites in Israel, who had moved from the south and had been oppressing Am Yisrael in the mainland by Emek Yisrael for 20 years. And we find it also, again, in the stories of Yehoshua ben Nun, the initial conquest of the northern kings of Israel. And what does this word mean? Vayam Hashem. All it means is God caused confusion. God caused a mehumah. But what's interesting is that in all of these stories, the mehumah is not explained. What did God do? Let's take a look. Yetziat Mitzrayim, Vayam Hashem et Machane Mitzrayim. God made a big mehumah in Eretz Mitzrayim. Only by Shirat Hayam do we hear what that mehumah, what the mayhem was, which, by the way, shares the same etymological root of Yaham, mehumah, mayhem. What was this mayhem that was created? All of a sudden, the Egyptian army pursuing the enslaved Israelites. As they're in the middle of pursuing them, what happens? We only hear this in Shirat Hayam, that the waters suddenly came crashing upon them. That was mayhem. And why did it cause mayhem? Because they're riding on horses and chariots that they're actually fastened to. So what couldn't they do? They couldn't get out. And they're drowning with their drowning horses. And those that do manage to free themselves from their chariots, it's now too late. They're already drowning. They're attempting to be saved, but the waters keep crashing upon them. Similarly, Vayam Hashem and Sisra, we also don't hear. What mu'umah did God perform for Sisra? We only hear in Shirat Hayam, in the Shirah of Devorah, the same mayhem by Kriyat Yamsuf, that there were sudden waters. It was the middle of the summer. It doesn't rain. And yet what happens? Flash flooding from miraculous rains that came down in the middle of the summer to drown out Sisra and his 900 chariots. That's the divine intervention that Shmuel HaNavi wants to show you. Do you see that Yetziat Mitzrayim was basically recreated, and not just against anyone, but the two remarkable nations known for their sus v'rechev, known for their horses and chariots, whether it was obviously the Egyptians who said, they're going to come, and they are so confident in their military prowess, certainly Sisra as well, and he just besieged Barak's army of 10,000 men. He had 900 chariots and multitudes throughout the entire valley, just waiting for Barak to come down the mountain. The word shalal and the plundering of shalal. Erdov fasik achalek shalal. The Egyptians were so convinced that what's going to happen when they defeat the Israelites, they'll plunder them for all the shalal that, by the way, Am Yisrael had borrowed from the Egyptians. We're going to take all the shalal. Similarly, in Shirat Devorah, we hear that the mother of Sisra is comforted. Don't worry, why is Sisra delayed? Because Sisra always takes care to plunder the spoils. I'm sure that Sisra is just waiting to get all the fashionable medals and all of the plunder, literally to plunder the spoils. Clearly, in both stories, the water is the instrument of salvation, the Yamsuf and Nachal Kishon in the case of Sisra. It's Hashem who is going to be the director, the heavenly forces in battle through mortal leaders, whether Moshe is going to lift his staff on Yamsuf as an extension of the hands of God, and certainly, and as Devorah herself says, Min hashamayim nilchamu hakochavim, that even though Barak was the military general, really the forces came from above. We also have the leaders who are interesting leaders. Moshe Rabbeinu, who himself was reluctant to serve as leader for Am Yisrael, but in the end does, and not only takes Am Yisrael, but defeats the Egyptians at Yamsuf. Similarly, Barak ben Avinoam, who tells Devorah, Ephes, I'm not going to fight, I'm nervous, you have to come with me. And I'm only going to go out to battle if you come with me. So sure enough, Barak, the reluctant leader, who ultimately is going to serve as the military victor in battle. Clearly, the role of women and women's song and victory. Whether it's Miriam HaNaviah, who all she has to do is lift up her tambourine to lead the women in song and dance. It's Yael, it's Devorah, who lead us in victory as well. Numerous parallels between Shirat Hayam, focusing on the salvation as Hashem's salvation, the drowning of the Egyptians. Shirat Devorah, also with the historical nuances, the remembrances of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the praises to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and at the same time, as Shirat Hayam also speaks about the unity of Am Yisrael, the emunah of Am Yisrael, then Shirat Devorah also expresses the final unity after numerous years of disunity. 7 of the 12 tribes of Israel participate in this victory. We also find, remarkably, that both stories contain the aftermath of the victory. In other words, how are different people responding to the stories of Yetziat Mitzrayim and Kriyat Yamsuf. In the case of Am Yisrael, we have Vayishma Yitro. Yitro hears of the story, and how does he respond? He ends up joining the camp of Israel, Baruch Hashem. Again, he says, Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol Elohim. Now I see that your Yud Kei Vav Kei God is stronger than any of the other forces. Yael, called Eshet Chever Hakeni, a descendant of Yitro, also responds to the military victory of Barak against Sisera by coming and recognizing her association with the God of Israel, and that's why she's willing to risk her life to kill Sisera. Clearly, what is Shmuel HaNavi trying to tell us? Excellent. After coming during the time of Yoshua ben Nun, but the conquest was still incomplete. Now we have a conquest that brings us back to the military victories of Mitzrayim, the salvation of Mitzrayim. And therefore, it's important to hear that Barak calls everyone up, and they're there throughout the night. And it's a night scene, ultimately, that obviously the actual battle taking place during the day. But it's a b'chatzi halayla. No, it's not. It's Laila. It's chatzi halayla. It's a salvation scene so similar, with so many thematic connections with the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Shmuel HaNavi is basically telling us this could have, should have been the story to end the redemption. After this story of Devorah, we should have had, as we know, Gidon. We should have had Malchut. But unfortunately, it was only a partial story. It's a story that certainly brings us back to the salvation of Mitzrayim in a beautiful way. So much so, the Chazal tell us these are the two songs that are most similar. We read Shirat Devorah as the Haftarah for Shabbat Shirah, a Parshat Shalach. They're both written, Livna al Gabi Ariach, a brick stone to show us a complete national military victory. That should have been it. Both of them eradicated the primary enemy during the time. The fear, even psychological fear of the Egyptians, the fear of the ancient Canaanites. But unfortunately, both stories also did not necessarily serve, as we know, as the completion of the emunah of Am Yisrael. So we turn now to the very next story, and we see that Shmuel HaNavi writes the story of Gidon with more parallels to Yetziat Mitzrayim, with more night scenes, telling us, okay, let's try it again. Again, maybe now we're going to be ready for Malchut. Let's take a look. He says we're going to start all over again. We're not even going to end with the salvation. Let's start with the very beginning. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu needed otot, he needed signs to believe in God's intervention. So too, Gidon consistently asked for otot. He asked for signs as well. And what sign does Hashem offer Gidon? Hashem offers Gidon the sign of bringing Gedi, Izim, and Matzot to the Malach, who tells him that he's going to be a leader, that he's going to be the one through whom the redemption, the salvation will take place. Izim and Matzah, remind you of anything? Karban Pesach and Matzah, that's his oath. So Hashem provides oath, and will provide numerous otot. Really, altogether, what do you know? Just like by Moshe Rabbeinu, 3 otot, 3 signs Hashem provides for Gidon. Gidon will provide a Karban Pesach of Matzah and Izim. And by the way, what comes as a result of this oath? A heavenly fire, just like by the Sneh. So we have Matzah. What do you know? When is going to be the time of redemption? Take a guess. What do you know? Laila Yetziat Mitzrayim, Vahi b'chatzi halayla. Hashem tells Gidon, this is also going to be an ambush attack at night, which is why he has to prepare and pottery vessels with fire inside, a lantern inside. Kum reid b'machaneh ki netatziv biyadacha halayla. It's going to be at night. And at night, this is when God rules. Hashem will not only kill the firstborn of Mitzrayim, this will be the moment of salvation for Am Yisrael. For their divine exodus, Hashem will provide divine assistance, the salvation for Gidon at night, as he finally attacks the large enemy, all of the Midianites who are encamped in Emek Yisrael. This divine assistance from oppression takes place with the few fighting against the many. Am Yisrael, a small peoples, and these Hebrew people in the midst of the strong, technologically advanced Mitzrayim. So too, 300 men of Gidon who are able to defeat the entire Midianite army. In both cases, we have a tremendous amount of fear. Whether it was Am Yisrael who feared the entire time, but definitely, even at the time of salvation, Vayiru, the people were afraid of the Egyptian army in pursuit of them. But in the end, that yir'ah was replaced with ri'iyah, with seeing these divine miracles of God, and ultimately, vaya'aminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe abdo. Their initial fear is replaced with faith in God. So too, the story of Gidon. Gidon is so fearful at all times, until he finally hears that even in the Midianite camp, they're afraid of literally the agricultural peoples. They're afraid of Am Yisrael. They're afraid of the big ball of barley banking down the tents, symbolizing the Midianite culture. They're afraid of Am Yisrael. And that's what gives Gidon the strength, or basically the trust, the emunah, that he can defeat an army just like Mitzrayim. And clearly, the sacrificial ritual, we said Karban Pesach, and the fire of gods, and Gidon offering a Karban Pesach, the fire coming down as well, telling us, yes, here's Karban Pesach again. This is going to be the salvation, this time against the Midianites instead of the Egyptians. This is the final victory. It's Karban Pesach all over again. It's salvation against our oppressors all over again. And this time we're in Eretz Yisrael. What should happen now? The people should ask for a king, and we should have stability, and we should have strong leadership. And guess what? The people do ask for a king, and yet Gidon's reluctance will once again play a role. No, Hashem Elokeichem Malkachem. You're not entirely right for this. So we have numerous messages of emunah, and only in the wake of Otot, Geula, the redemption that comes through really a divine plan and assistance. We have the night scene as that drastic climactic change, the night that symbolizes, again, that transition from a state of oppression to a state of salvation, and the few against the many redemption that should have led to the last stages, namely of Malchut, but it didn't. So then we turn to another opportunity. The next time that we find a night scene to this regard, with all these numerous parallels, is now going to be at the end of Sefer Shoftim. So his Shoftim screen is still open. And now he wants to tell us who's the new enemy? The age-old enemy coming from the western front of Gaza, the Plishtim. And who, this time, is going to be the Moshe-like character through whom salvation will come? Shimshon. So just as we have a miraculous birth and salvation of Moshe, we have a miraculous birth and salvation of Shimshon. But most remarkably, we have, what do you know? B'chatzi halayla. B'chatzi halayla vayakam Shimshon. Now, here again, Chad has it wrong. It's not actually vayihi b'chatzi halayla. It should say b'chatzi halayla. So they made a mistake. I'm sorry, I should have caught this. B'chatzi halayla vayakam Shimshon. But you're all supposed to say, come on, that's, as the Baal HaTurim says, as close as one can see to a very conscious textual parallel. This is the first time that we have the words b'chatzi halayla since Yetziat Mitzrayim. What is Shmuel HaNavi trying to tell us? He's telling us this could be it. Everyone get ready. This is a night scene. This is a time that the Plishtim are oppressing us. This could be the time that we have final salvation from our arch enemy, the Plishtim. And what should happen after this? Then Mashiach. Chazal say, Shimshon, could have been Mashiach. How do they know that? Because it's B'chatzi Halayla. This should be it. This should be it. Let's take a look. Are we getting excited? Pretend you don't know the story, though. Yeah, no, because the story is only told, interestingly, in just a few verses. Albeit we then have the beginning of the failure that leads to the final ends of Shimshon. Shoftim Perek Tetzayin, Pasuk Gimel. B'chatzi halayla vayakam Shimshon. Shimshon is going to come to redeem the people. He's by a prostitute all night, and then he rises at midnight to break free from the oppressors, the Plishtim in Gaza. And what do you know? What does he do? He doesn't just break free and burn them like he did to the foxes of the Plishtim of Ashdod and Ashkelon. Instead, he breaks out of Gaza by uprooting the city gate, physically overcoming oppression. Am Yisrael leave also through the Pesach of the Bayit, right? A very similar idea, the threshold. And Shimshon carries the gates of Gaza and exits, imagine this, he goes all the way from Gaza, continues east over the mountains to Har Hebron, showing Yetziat Mitzrayim. I'm taking the Petach of the Choma with me, just like Bnei Yisrael leave, and breaking free from Paro's control. Clearly, it's Shimshon's metaphysical strength that allowed him to escape, just like Am Yisrael recognized this is all supernatural. And we have, again, what should have been the end. It should have been complete salvation. But Shimshon knows that in order for there to be complete salvation, who has to come and attack? The Am. The Am has to go. Hashem says, tell the Am. They have to cross ultimately. They have to do something. They have to leave. Shimshon takes the gates, symbolizing the Petach of the Bayit B'chatzi Halayla of Mitzrayim. And he stands atop of Har Hebron, overlooking the entire area of Judea, where Shevet Yehuda, the militants, should see that now Gaza is vulnerable like never before. And what should have happened? They should have galvanized and gone to finish off the Gaza Mitzrayim saga. But instead, they don't. And the completion of what should have been B'chatzi Halayla never takes place. Instead, we have Shimshon bringing down the Plishtim just on his own. And Shimshon, in the end, dying with this. And as Shimshon bringing down the temple of the Plishtim and ultimately destroying his captors, Shimshon sacrifices himself almost like a Karban Pesach in order to defeat his enemies. What a failed attempt at what Shmuel HaNavi is trying to say this could have. This should have been B'chatzi Halayla. This should have been Mishichut. This should have been complete salvation. And yet it wasn't.
I was wondering why these two tzaddikim, Boaz and Ruth and Shimshon. And I remember that I learned that the Mashiach's mother will come from Dan, and Dan is Shimshon, and the father will come from Yehuda, which is Boaz and David. So it's going to be Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla to reflect the first Geula, which is Mitzrayim. The last Geula, which will be the Mashiach, should be those two tzaddikim, somebody from Dan and somebody from Ruth.
Beautiful. Isn't that beautiful? That's my mother. Yes, it's needed. So it seems that really Chazal are building off of which story? What story definitely leads to Geula? David HaMelech. Which means that David HaMelech's ancestors are from a Boaz from Yehuda and Ruth from
Shimshon from
Ruth from Moab, which is also part of the story. But that's exactly it. Chazal say, but Shmuel HaNavi wants to tell us something. Shmuel HaNavi is trying to tell us that the Shimshon story was the first stage, right? That you couldn't have had the David story without first defeating the Plishtim. So it must be that Dan will play a role as well, which then he goes back to his Shoftim screen. And what does he put in at the end of Sefer Shoftim then? You need to know more about which two tribes in particular, Dan and Yehuda. And he'll tell you a negative story about Dan, and he'll tell you a negative story about Yehuda, so that you realize, are Dan and Yehuda really ready for redemption yet? Not yet.
Yeah, just to point out that the Mishkan was built by Bezalel and Ahaliah.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. And Shmuel HaNavi isn't getting these ideas anywhere. He says, ultimately, how do we know that something has to be built, that Malchut Basar Vadam has to be built by Dan and Yehuda? Because Malchut Hashem, the first Mishkan, is built by Dan and Yehuda, Bezalel from Yehuda, and Ohaliah ben Achisamach from Shevet Dan. Kol HaKavod. Beautiful. So what we generally learn as Midrash, we now see is really is really alluded to already in the text itself. So now we continue and we see, notice the highlight, the imagery of the city gates of the Petach of the Bayit, demonstrating the Petach of the Bayit, again, removing the Bayit, removing one's identity, removing dominance over the captors, just like Am Yisrael mark their doorposts with blood, signaling their freedom. Whether it's the Plishtim who believe they're stronger than Shimshon, Hashem grants him the strength to prevail, just like Paro resists Hashem's will, Hashem ultimately forces Paro to submit to divine power, and Shimshon, in the end though, will act alone, bringing retribution upon the Plishtim, and Hashem will also bring the judgment upon Mitzrayim, telling us that, again, the people were passive, they didn't respond. But note that the turning point is B'chatzi Halayla, where an oppressed figure or a nation breaks through, and through supernatural intervention. Both stories talk about the possibility for redemption and power, ultimate destruction, reinforcing not only these themes of justice, divine justice in Tanakh, but also anticipation of salvation, which is not always completed. And just to show how much it's not completed, Shmuel HaNavi then juxtaposes the previous chapter to a horrific, notorious story of another night scene, trying to explain why we're not ready for Malchut and true redemption yet. And that is the story of Pilegesh B'Giva. He writes another story of a woman who is forcibly taken by her pseudo-husband as a concubine just to be provided for. But instead of providing for her, and we hear that he's looking for a bayit, a home. He's looking for a home as he travels from taking her forcibly from her father in Bethlehem. He takes her from a house of bread and he treks her through the mountains until the night. And the Nar says, can't we stop by the Jebusite city? He says, no, the Jebusites are they're Nochrim. Yeah, no, we don't go to Nachri cities. And instead he ends up in Giv'ah, in Binyamin. And he's invited to a bayit with his Na'ar. But he leaves his Na'ara outside. He leaves the Pilegesh outside of the bayit, as opposed to Bnei Yisrael, who enter the bayit on the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the place of protection, while the destructive forces will reign outside. And therefore, it's not only a night scene, but again, at the Petach HaBayit, at the place of transition, at the site of fates, just like Am Yisrael had to cover their Petach of the Bayit, the Mashkov, the Mezuzot, with the blood, and the Ezov, so that Hashem Pasach, so that Hashem will hover and protect them at the thresholds of their Bayit. We find that the man sends the Pilegesh outside, and she then will come back after being raped to near death she will wait by the Petach HaBayit in the morning. And what is this a story of? Am Yisrael are required to come in together as a bayit, to come in as a family, sel leveit avot sel habayit, and kemechsat nefashot tachosu al haseh. Show that you are not a stone-like people. Show that you're not like the self-irrigated areas of stone and Mitzrayim that aren't vulnerable in the eyes of God and therefore are self-absorbed people. Show that you can bring others into your home so that you can participate together. Come together as a bayit, display responsibility for each other, provide matzot, which is what you provide for your guests. Instead, we see that the people of Giv'ah do not invite anyone inside. And that's why the man ultimately will go on his own to the person from Ephraim and instead even suggest that his own daughters be cast outside to be raped. And the man himself says, we won't take responsibility. The people of Giv'ah don't take responsibility. He casts out his own concubine. His own bayit will be outside of the bayit, where ultimately she will lay near dead by the petach of the bayit. So we find the thematic focus. If there will be salvation at night, it has to come through collective morality before you have geula. That's why we have to come and show that we're not like Mitzrayim. We take the set. We go back to the stories, even in Mitzrayim, of Lot's Pesach with matzot. We come inside the bayit and leave the negative forces outside. And collectively, we restore family values. Only then are we ready for redemption. The stories of Sefer Shoftim have not only cycled out of control to a topsy-turvy world of anarchy, where women are serving and instead of the men, in the army where women or where left-handed men are leaders instead of right-handed men. These are all, again, subjective to the time period. But in fact, what Shmuel HaNavi is trying to say is look then at the last stage. Not only were we close in the time of Devorah and Gidon, we did have a pseudo Yetziat Mitzrayim, but then we got to the state of Shimshon. We could have had the salvation of the petach of the Shar Ha'ir even. And that didn't materialize. Want to know why? Look at the people who don't bear responsibility, who aren't living up to the values of a bayit. And when you don't live up to the values of a bayit, and you don't show respect to the women of the household, then not only will you not have salvation, but you will have a night that is going to be a turning point. The night for the Pilegeshet men being raped all night and ultimately led to civil war and destruction of the entire tribe, nearly of Binyamin. It became a night of catastrophe instead of a night of the deaths of the firstborn of the Egyptians. Instead, it was the death of members of Am Yisrael. The aftermath, therefore, by Yetziat Mitzrayim, Hashem says, remember, this is a sign of how God takes care. God takes care of the ger, yatom, and almanah. God takes care of the girim. Remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's the perfect paradigm for God fighting for justice. And remember for future generations to take care of the underdogs in society. Take care of the concubines. Take care of those that can't take care of themselves. And sure enough, the story of Pilegesh Begivah, undermining that Laila, undermining the entire, not just attempt, but the potential salvation that led to destruction. Here we find the contrast between what could be and what was. The contrast between chaos and order, betrayal and redemption, destruction and national formation. In both stories, the house and the doorway serve as the pivotal spaces where decisions shape life and death, while the concept of responsibility emerges as the core element that determines a nation's moral fate. And therefore, for those who remember from Sefer Shmuel, we're not surprised then that as Shmuel writes the stories where there's already monarchy, he talks about Shaul Kol Halayla, the night scene of fighting against the Plishtim, which begin with the fateful words of Vayosha Hashem Vayom Hahu. Get ready, now Shaul is going to fight against the Plishtim, and what could it lead to? It could lead to redemption. In the end, we learned the story. What did it lead to? Not redemption, not proper sacrifice of a Karban Pesach, but instead, it led to Iver min hachai. It led to Shaul keeping the people up all night, just so that they could fix it, not by fighting against the Plishtim, but by sacrificing properly. And then he doesn't wipe out Amalek. He doesn't finish off what a king should do, the last stages of redemption of Malchut. And therefore, Shmuel writes about himself. He cries, Kol halayla. What is he trying to do the whole night? Shift the tide. Turn it from the end of Malchut to the possible beginning. But not to worry, because that's when he turns to the final screen. That's when he turns to Sefer Ruth and he says, now, only after the failure of Shaul, now I'm going to finally share with you what will finally be the core of redemption, at that final state of salvation. All these attempts, Devorah was a nice try, it was partial. Gidon, another revisiting of Yetziat Mitzrayim, didn't complete it. Not only that, spiraled out of control. Take a look at the Shimshon stories, Apilegesh Bigeva stories. They could have fixed the problems, but instead they highlight the problems. Not to worry. He begins Sefer Shmuel. Who's going to serve as the antidote? Who will be that Mashiach Hashem? Who will finally bring us to redemption? Shaul. First he writes, Shaul. Kol halayla. Shaul is going to redeem us. But no, in the end, that night isn't a night of salvation. Shmuel HaNavi's attempt to finally fix the problems of Shaul throughout the night. But the night problems aren't fixed until he writes the final story. He writes a story that tells us, he says, get ready. I'm now going to tell you, once and only once Hashem says, go and anoint David, he says, now it's time to tell you that the true Malchut, he said, didn't start with David. Let me write to you how during the time of the Shoftim, all those night stories, all those parallels to Yetziat Mitzrayim, there must have been another. And it's not as if Shmuel HaNavi was a fly on the wall during the scene of Boaz and Ruth. As a matter of fact, he didn't even write it b'nevuah. These are Shmuel's words. This is his brilliant Ruach HaKodesh, trying to tell us that I'm telling you, I'm writing the final story of salvation for you, teaching you where ultimately it's going to come from. So how does he set up the scene for us? Vayhi b'mei shvot hashoftim, vayhi ra'av ba'aretz. He brings us back to a famine. Okay, I know about a famine. Famine in the land brings us back to whose time period? Yes, Abraham, and yes, Yitzchak, but also Yaakov. Ve'achazek hara'av be'eretz Mitzrayim. The Rav is everywhere, and also in Egypt, where they generally have the Nile. Now they don't even have the waters of the Nile. And just in case you're not sure that he's setting you up for the famine of Egypt, so the next pasuk, Vishem ha'ish Elimelech, Vishem ishto Naomi, Vishem shnei banav machlon b'chol yom, Vishem Shem ha'achat Orpah, Shem ha'shenit Ruth. He highlights the Shemot. He's telling us, can you go back to another Ra'ab story where the Shemot of Bnei Israel are going to be focused upon, where we hear of Ish uveito ba'u. And both stories start with Shemot. Both stories start with Yaakov Ish uveito, Elimelech in Beit Lechem. Excellent. They're both Bayit stories. And just in case you're not convinced, Vayelech Ish mi Beit Lechem Yehuda Lagur b'Sdei Moab. Again, the Baal Turim, who has, again, as we know, again, an intertextual approach, sees all of Tanakh in front of him at one time, says on the pasuk, wait a second, and when he reads Sefer Shmot, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach et bat Levi, he says there's only one other time in the entire Tanakh where we find Vayelech ish, and when is that? He says, Vayidach vayelech ish mi beit Lechem. What does this tell you? Al yedei mi beit Lechem Yehuda, al yedei halicha zo ba hagoel harishon. And then, al yedei halicha yavo hagoel hacharon, shu Mashiach ben David. Shmuel HaNavi is already alluding. Vayelech ish mi beit Lechem. Please remember that even though many other events are going to happen, it's not going to be this ish in particular. But please remember the other Vayelech ish mi beit. Who is that? Amram, who marries Yocheved, and what happens as a result? Moshe, the Redeemer, is born. What's he already telling you at the beginning of Sefer Ruth? Get ready, because a Redeemer, by the end, a Redeemer is going to be born. And just like Vayelech ish mi beit introduced the first Redeemer of Israel, Vayelech ish mi beit is going to introduce the final Redeemer of Israel. But you may not be convinced yet, so let's go on. Yeah, now sure enough, what happens? We find, oh my gosh, Devorah, Elimelech dies, and his two sons die. Sons dying. Does that remind you of anything? A lot of sons dying in Egypt. And then we find it's not just Moshe who will become the paradigmatic figure, not just center focus on Moshe, but we hear about the only real positive father-in-law, son-in-law relationship in Tanakh, namely Moshe Yitro, right? And almost, and not the most natural relationship. And sure enough, then Shmuel HaNavi plays on this and says, Anna, you want to hear about the most unnatural mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship in Tanakh? Here it is. Again, Ruth and Naomi, who ultimately love and respect one another. I just have to say as a side that I gave a shiur on mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law when I was engaged to my husband in my future in-laws' home. And so I told them, I said, yes, of course, that's the goal, and Baruch Hashem, to have that Ruth and Naomi relationship. So I want to thank my mother-in-law for that relationship. Mom, if you're hearing this. Okay, in any case, again, that is the Ruth and Naomi, certainly parallel to Moshe and Yitro. And then we have also stories about Moshe time and time again. We don't just hear about a Redeemer who performs miracles. And rather, what makes Moshe the Redeemer is because Moshe takes care of the underdog. Moshe saves the Hebrew slave who's oppressed by the Egyptian taskmaster. Moshe saves the damsels in distress from all the shepherds in Midian. So too, Boaz the Redeemer, all we're going to hear about is how he takes care of the weak, of the indigent in society. So that was just setting us up. But now comes the finale. We hear about how Boaz takes care of Ruth for the summer. But Naomi basically says, she says, that's short-term taking care of. I don't want a short-term shuvah, return to the land, and short-term chesed. I'm looking for, she says it, geula. I think Boaz could be the goel. And what she means in that context is someone who will ultimately redeem the land and provide for the perpetuation of name and identity long-term. That actually is what geula is. It is the restoration of national identity. So if Moshe Rabbeinu was able to provide it the first time along, but ultimately it was the salvation, the divine salvation, let's just remember the two stories of redemption. The first story of redemption, we already saw, Vayehi b'chatzi halayla, v'Hashem hika kol b'chor be'eretz Mitzrayim. God is going to strike down the enemy. And time again, Shmuel HaNavi wrote these stories. We were back there. God struck down the enemy of Sisera. God struck down the enemy of Midian. God struck down, through Shimshon, the enemy of the Plishtim. Incomplete. Laila. Even b'chatzi halayla. Shmuel says, now I'm going to share with you the story of completion, of redemption. Vayehi b'chatzi halayla. Now I'm ready to tell you the true story of Geula. And we're all thinking, the butterflies are rising. We're waiting for Kriyat Yamsuf. We're waiting for thunderous skies. We're waiting for lanterns on the Midianite camp. We're waiting for gates and houses to be destroyed. But instead, we're ready for this. No divine intervention. And here it is. It's midnight when God controls, and we don't even hear about God. A man faints because a woman is by his feet. Okay, let's go back to Shmuel just for a minute. What happens there? God through Paro says, we have Paro who after years of oppressing the Hebrew people says, get out of here, get out. Oh, you know what? Can you give me a bracha? Give me a bracha. I can give your oppressor a bracha. Boaz turns to Ruth, the poor, oppressed, and he says, I want to give you a bracha. You should be blessed. You should be blessed, BT, because the fact that you're here shows that you're doing this for Naomi. You're willing to forfeit your future to marry anyone you want, to marry someone within the family, so that there will be the perpetuation of a name through the land. Wow. Am Yisrael, as they were leaving Mitzrayim, and we know that they weren't even provided with any food. They took their raw dough. Their oppressors didn't give them anything. Boaz, before even leaving Ruth and gives her, he says, he lets her, he doesn't kick her out in the middle of the night, even though very unbecoming for a woman to be in the men's locker room in the Goren in the middle of the night. He says, you can stay till morning. And the next morning, he provides her with enough food for her and for Naomi for breakfast. As opposed to Paro, get out of here, get out without any lechem. It was Hashem who made sure that we would not leave empty-handed. In the story of Ruth and Boaz, it's Boaz who makes sure that Ruth will not leave empty-handed. It's Hashem in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim who makes sure that we have an omer of man to collect every day. It's going to be Boaz who makes sure that Ruth has enough omer to collect every day for herself and for Naomi. So what is Shmuel HaNavi trying to tell us? He's telling us that the true redemption will happen again, but it's not going to happen with fanfare. It's not going to happen with the same level of miraculous, supernatural, divine intervention. Do you want to know how the final Geula will happen, he says? I wrote all these stories thinking, now's the time for Geula, now's the time for Geula. We're waiting now for miracles from the sky, for more Iranian missiles. We're waiting for, I don't know, a nuclear plant to blow up. No, we're not. Shmuel HaNavi says, you know how the final redemption will take place? B'chatzi halayla, that moment of transition, it will be when a person looks out for the other. It will be when, in the middle of the night, we pay attention and we listen to what someone else is going through. It will happen when we provide a Shabbos meal for someone, maybe her husband is in Miluim, and she doesn't have time to prepare it. It will be when we can invite others into our home and not cast them out. It will be when we can pay attention to those that other people look down upon. That's how Geula will happen. And therefore, it's not surprising that David HaMelech himself would make sure to get up, b'chatzi halayla. Chazal teach us, Amar Avushaya, Amar Ravacha, source number 2 on page number 6. Me'olam lo avar alai chatzi layla v'shina, based on the pasuk in Tehillim, chatzi layla akum lo dot lacha. David HaMelech waited till chatzi halayla. David simna hayalo. What did he have? His own alarm clock. What was that? Kinor hayat talui lemala mimitato shel David v'kivan shegiach chatzot layla. He would wait for chatzot halayla. that climactic moment of salvation, when the northern wind would come and wake him up with nigunim miyad haya omed b'osei b'Torah. One idea that the Midrash is saying is, what did he feel was going to bring Geula? Torah. Take a look at the Midrash Rabbah. You want to know what he did every night? B'chatzot laila haya omedu menageh bahen. Or it says, Lahodot al mishpatei tzidkacha. Mishpatim shevet al Mitzrayim v'tzedakot asher asita ma'avotinu b'Mitzrayim. He would remind God of salvation and remind God, it's Chatzi Alayla, it's time to bring it again. But HaNavi already told us how is it going to be brought? Not with missiles, no, not with miracles. It's going to be brought by those everyday chasadim that we perform one for the other. Rav Yoel ben Nun says, if you look very carefully, you see that Sefer Shemot basically continues the toladot of Sefer Breshit. The word toladot that appears 12 times is the motif of Sefer Breshit. Toladot appears 12 times, 12 times in Tanakh, 10 times in Sefer Breshit, literally building up Toldot Ha'adam, Toldot Yaakov, teaching us how to build up the nation. Then we have Toldot again, the Toldot of Aaron and Moshe, the Toldot really of Kahuna. The last time, the 12th time that the word Toldot will be employed will be in Sefer Ruth by Shmuel HaNavi. What is Shmuel HaNavi trying to say? Ele Toldot, these are the Toldot of Peretz ben Yehuda. These are the Toldot of Melucha as the Chotemet. This is the final stage of a Toldot HaMelucha of Beit David that will complete the Toldot of Kahuna and will complete the Toldot of the Ummah of the nation. And that's why if we look carefully, Shmuel HaNavi incorporates these ideas. He weaves them through the narrative of Sefer Ruth over and over again. When Boaz comes to Ruth and he says, Tihi maskoretech shlema me'it Hashem, asher bat lachasot tachak knafav, may God reward you for coming under his wings. Vayhi b'chatzi alayla, that night in the Goren, Ruth turns to Boaz and she says, Ufarasta knafecha ala matacha, ki goel ata. Don't leave Geula up to God. It doesn't have to be God who spreads his wings. You can spread your wings. Goel ata. We're going to be the ones who bring the final redemption. And it's not just the final redemption of Chesed. We're going to be the ones to build the Bayit. Shmuel HaNavi writes that ultimately it's David who builds the Bayit. And he builds it on a Goren, reminding us that even the Beit HaMikdash, the place of the Beit HaMikdash, is built on HaGoren. No, not the same threshing floor in Beit Lechem, but yes, HaGoren. Shmuel HaNavi is alluding back to the Goren. The Beit HaMikdash is also founded on what happened B'chatzi Halayla in the Goren of Sefer Ruth, where ultimately Boaz takes care of Ruth and Ruth takes care of Naomi. So perhaps the Geula, in fact, will come. Vayhi b'chatzi halayla. Perhaps it will come, this Leil HaSeder. But don't expect any bombastic miracles. It will come when we go out and say, Kol dich ben yete b'yechu, when we extend ourselves and our homes and our hearts to one another. And if it doesn't come this Pesach, I'm not going to cry, because I'll wait till Chatzi Halayla in the Goren. Then that means that there are still some acts of chesed to be done. And as Rav Kook says beautifully, he says the first Geula required the intervention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is why we read Shir Hashirim with its romance and its passion, and God's Hitzaruta Dila'el, and God's initiative from above. But Shavuos teaches us that we can be the ones to initiate, and we can be the ones to inspire. And we can read what looks like a very secular story, but becomes the paradigmatic story of chesed, of caring one for the other, that will bring through Hitzaruta Dilatata, through the initiations of us, of the people down below, through mundane acts of chesed, will bring the final Vayhi b'chatzi halayla of Geula. Rabbi Zera explains, read Shir Hashirim, get excited. But you want to know why Ruth was canonized? To teach you not just about chesed, but kama sacharto l'gomlei chasadim. Because ultimately, The result, the reward for chesed is geula, is that final redemption. Chazal teach us, had Boaz only known that this would be the story of redemption, that it would be recorded how he took care of Ruth in the fields and in the Goren, instead of giving her breakfast, he would have given her, again, so much more, he would have given her fattened calves. But that's exactly it. He didn't know. We never know the ripple effects of what we do. We never know what happens if we stop to pick up a trapeze who needs a ride. We never know, the ripple effects of a smile in a hallway. We never know the ripple effects of sending a message, of giving a phone call, maybe even just responding with a heart emoji. You never know the effects. And it's those small acts that lead to the geula. One of my favorite midrashim on Ruth, source number 10, Rabbi Eliezer says, Boaz asad shalo, Ruth asad shala, Naomi asad shala. You want to know what the story tells us? You want to know how Shmuel HaNavi is writing it? He writes about what Boaz does of his initiative and the chesed of Ruth to Naomi and the aspect of Naomi, her chesedim and her desire for geula. Look at what they're all doing. Look at how they're taking care of each other. Look at the chasadim that they're performing. B'chatzi halayla, afani hesed sheli. Now it's time, says Hashem, to play my part as well. Only once we act with chesed to bring geula, will HaKadosh Baruch Hu then come and complete the stages of geula, because Ruth and Boaz and the Goren will ultimately build the bayit of David as Oved Oledet Yishai, Yishai Oledet David. And Shmuel's final comment is, if you really want the stories of Galut to end, then reread Yetziat Mitzrayim, but even more important, this Pesach, recognize that there is a lot that happens b'chatzi halayla because of divine intervention, that there's a lot to work on from Pesach and onward to make sure that our acts of chesed bring vayhi b'chatzi halayla a geulat Mashiach ben David. Chag Sameach. I'll drop you off.